Good morning, everyone. Welcome to my lecture on the subject Classical and Modern Literature. Today our lecture theme is dedicated to the Romantic period in American literature, which starts from the 1830s to 1870. And also we're gonna have a discussion about American Renaissance, and we will talk about Edgar Allan Poe's poems, works, and also you'll have a brief information about Emily Dickinson. Romantic period in American literature was a time of rapid expansion and growth. The United States, which fueled intuition, imagination, and individualism in literature. 1830, just 50 years after the Revolutionary War, America was still really young, but its citizens were anxious to create their own identity that was uniquely American and not so reliant on European values. Therefore, the American Romantic movement challenged the very rational thinking that we saw in the Age of Reason. During the Revolutionary War, so this period produced fewer instructional texts and more stories, novels, and poetry. Within these stories, novels, and poems, there are 5 characteristics that we can use to identify American Romantic literature. These are imagination, individuality, nature as a source of spirituality, looking to the past for wisdom, seeing the common man as a hero. The first of these characteristics is imagination, or we can call it as escapism. This period falls in line with the Industrial Revolution, which was a great time of progress, and in many cases, when there is a progress, there is also great optimism. People start to imagine what could happen next. And progress continues on the flip side of that. With that much progress, a lot of people began migrating to big cities that were becoming overpopulated. Cities became dirty and disease-ridden, so it's not surprised that many people wanted to escape. Therefore, the American Romantic writers embraced that an ocean through escapism. This is where the mind allows you to escape harsh conditions by taking you to a place that is purely beautiful. Characters in romantic literature are often journeying away from the city and into the countryside to a place that has improbable and even supernatural qualities. The authors develop this place with imagery to make the reader experience the locale as if it was real. Washington Irving, who is known as the father of American literature, wrote a story called Rip Van Winkle, which is about a man who wanders out in the woods to escape some horrors his wife is asking him to do after the falling asleep for 20 years in the woods. He not only escapes his horse but his wife as well, because she is dead. This fanciful escape is typical during this time, but it's something we still see in movies today. Okay, let's think about the movie Avatar. Jake Sully is able to escape by assuming a new identity in a beautiful new world. Even the audience, as they watch, is able to escape reality as they experience the fantastical world of Pandora. So we can note that escapism is still continuing in American contemporary literature. The second characteristic used to identify American Romanticism is individuality. As people are moving into the frontier, they are establishing new areas in ways that best suit their needs. Not only are people moving across the country, but into the country, immigration begins creating what we now call the melting pot in America as a result. So we can see that not only people creating an identity for themselves, but the country creating its own identity is people with different social paths come together to create something new. Americans also wanted to distance themselves from Europe and become intellectually independent. This shows up in literature, with characters who live on the outskirts of society, kind of like that old school cowboy. They are going to follow the norms that have come over Europe. Americans were going to follow their intuition, their feeling, and they are going to embrace this newly found freedom and become individuals. Third, we have nature as a source of spirituality. Remember, initially the Puritans were coming to the colonies to escape religious persecution in England, and those Puritans' ideas did not disappear when the country was establishing. During this time, the Romantics want to embrace that spiritual root that was planted by the Puritans. So to do that, they were taking what was established in that spiritual realm, but then taking it into nature now, where the Puritans saw nature as savage with the devil hiding behind every tree. The Romantics really are finding God in nature. They believed that they could achieve high levels of insight and information about the world around them just by going to date. Sir William Cullen Bryant was a poet during this time, and he wrote a poem called Thanatopsis. It's a prime example of looking into nature. In his work, William Cullen Bryant tries to explore death through the life cycles that we see in nature. He finds both comfort for the living and for the dying. So in his point of view, death is just a chance to go back to nature. The fourth characteristic is the idea that wisdom can be gained from the past. Writers like Washington Irving used old legends to create new stories, and whereas the novelists and short story writers tried to distance themselves from European tradition writing, the poets stick to that tradition. Their form is the same, their techniques are the same. However, they are truly unique in their content, and they are looking at the pure nature America has to offer and are using that for their inspiration. So this is encouraged as a group called the Fireside Poets, who are known because people sat by the fire and read their poems in the evenings. Kind of like how we sit and watch our favorite TV shows. At night, it was a form of entertainment. Now, in American Romantic period, there were four fireside poets that we have to know, and all of them really had long names. The first one, Henry Wadsworth Longfellow; the second one, John Greenleaf Whittier; the third one, Oliver Wendell Holmes; the last one, James Russell Lowell. These four guys were well known in their time, and even though their style was not unique, the fireside romantic poets are still recognized as some of America's greatest poets ever. As our final characteristic, we have the common man as our hero prior to this time. The European hero had been established as a sophisticated and educated, and Ben Franklin fits into this mold. He was educated, he was inventor, he helped establish the country. This is a man who has looked up to as a hero. American romantics turned away from that. James Fenimore Cooper is known for writing the first American novel starring the character Natty Bump, or that name does not sound very hero. Natty Bumppo becomes the first American hero. He's young, he's innocent, and awkward with the ladies, but he has a solid moral code. If he doesn't always follow society's rules, he has intuition about people he loves. And he loved nature, and he was questing for higher truth. He was a character like a Luke Skywalker. One day he's out shooting womp rats, and the next he's flying an X-Wing Indiana Jones. By the way, Indiana Jones is also a good example of the American hero. He doesn't change as he tackles his adventures, but we know that his heart is always in the right place. So, to sum up this part of our lecture, we can say that we can identify American romantics by 5 characteristics. Number 1, imagination and escapism, taking a journey from the dirty city into the supernatural countryside. Number 2, individuality, individuals embracing freedom by following intuition and going exploring. Number 3, finding spirituality in nature, reflections on nature and how it can bring people closer to God. Number 4, looking to the past for wisdom, settings that reflect times and plots that show how legends fit in today. And number 5, finding a hero in the common man, characters who are flawed but whose innocence and strong morals give them good hearts, and that summarizes American literature during the Romantic period.
Transcendentalism was an intellectual, semi-religious movement that emerged in New England at roughly the same period as Romanticism's heyday in American literature in the late 1820s and 30s. The basic idea of transcendentalism is the exploration of a naturalistic and unstructured spirituality. It is interesting to note, however, that both transcendentalism and Romanticism are built on the foundation of Puritanism, which pervasively touched every aspect of American life. Take, for example, these words from the Puritan Jonathan Edwards' personal narrative. God's excellency, his wisdom, his purity and love, seemed to appear in everything, in the sun, moon, and stars, in the clouds and blue sky, in the grass, flowers, trees, in the water, and all nature, which used greatly to fix my mind. It is striking to note Edwards' emerging focus on nature's reflection of the sublime, as would be seen in the American Romantic movement, while his striving to express God and to understand his nature can also be seen as somewhat of a precursor to the Transcendentalist movement. In the book The Spirituality of American Transcendentalists, it is explained that the Transcendentalists were children of the Unitarians, who emerged from the liberal wing of Puritanism. Even as they rebelled against their past, the Transcendentalists continued to embody these Puritan tendencies and qualities. Like their ancestors, too, they were haunted by their sense of morality and the moral law, and they thought of the task of spreading their new gospel as a vocation, a calling by God. The Transcendentalists preached with a confidence and an optimism that matched their ancestors' sense of intimacy with God.
The first thing we have to say respecting what are called new views here in New England at the present time is that they are not new, but the very oldest of thoughts cast into the mold of these new times. What is popularly called transcendentalism among us is idealism. Idealism as it appears in 1842.
Transcendentalism was pioneered by the great essayist Ralph Waldo Emerson, whose spiritual journey as a Unitarian minister eventually brought him to the conclusion that institutionalized religion was a barrier to an individual's full union with God.
We live in succession, in division, in parts, in particles. Meantime, within man is the soul of the whole, the wise silence, the universal beauty, to which every part and particle is equally related, the eternal one. We see the world piece by piece, as the sun, the moon, the animal, the tree. But the whole, of which these are the shining parts, is the soul.
After quitting his pastorship, Emerson turned to writing and publishing, and published the groundbreaking essay Nature in 1836, establishing the basic beliefs of what would soon become Transcendentalism. In the following years, Emerson and other like-minded thinkers in Massachusetts formed a think tank called the Transcendental Club to discuss these ideas. Today's readers will find that at the core of Emerson's Transcendentalism lies the concept of individualism. This concept finds itself a sort of manifesto in his essay Self-Reliance, where he argues for the need for the individual to not be a conformist and powerfully disclaims any who do not follow their own instincts and intuitions. Interestingly, the word individualism was not even coined at the time. As Tocqueville famously says in Democracy in America, individualism is a word recently coined to express a new idea. Our fathers only knew about egoism. It is important when understanding the Transcendentalist movement to realize that the concept of individualism was an emerging and not well-established concept at the time. As modern readers, we look back at Emerson's words and connect perhaps too readily with the ideas of individualism we know today. Take, for example, Reebok's commercial UBU, which consists entirely of Emerson's transcendental doctrine.
Whoso would be a man must be a nonconformist. A foolish consistency is the hobgoblin of little minds. To be great is to be misunderstood. There is a time in every man's education when he arrives at the conviction that envy is ignorance, that imitation is suicide, that he must take himself for better, for worse, as his portion. Insist on yourself, never imitate. God will not have his work made manifest by cowards. Discontent is the want of self-reliance. It is infirmity of will. Nothing is at last sacred but the integrity of your own mind. Society everywhere is in conspiracy against the manhood of every one of its members. To believe your own thought, to believe that what is true for you in your private heart is true for all men, that is genius.
Perhaps Emerson did not mean that by buying mass-produced image icons such as sneakers, we would be seizing our individualism. Or maybe he would buy a pair himself. We will let you decide. One of the more influential of Emerson's Transcendentalist colleagues was Margaret Fuller, who edited the Transcendental Club's literary journal, The Dial. Fuller managed to contribute both to literary criticism, exploring the definition of American literature, and to women's rights. Margaret Fuller is considered to be a founder of modern feminism. But what exactly did Transcendentalists believe? Rather than getting entangled in proving or disproving doctrine, Transcendentalists emphasize forming a close relationship with God and the universe by relying on the personal intuition rather than the external tuition. Emerson spoke feelingly on disregarding any external forces that ran against the grain of individual intuition, which he described as revelation for the present age. Compared to personal witness of divine truth, external mandates, proofs, and miracles were inferior evidences of religion. The Romanticist fascination with nature was echoed by the Transcendentalists, who respected nature as a place removed from the corrupting interference of human society. Transcendentalists believed God could be found everywhere, but that it was easier to connect with him in a natural setting. Hence Thoreau's retreat to Walden Pond, and hence also the formation of a utopian farming community outside Boston by several members of the Transcendental Club. Transcendentalism came down to spirituality instead of physicality, the idea of forming spiritual connections to your inner self, to God, and to the universe in order to transcend the mundane distractions of physical existence. These ideas informed the writings of authors for years to come. Walt Whitman's Leaves of Grass, for example, explored the poet's relationship with the broader universe, and Louisa May Alcott interacted from a younger age with the great minds of the Transcendental Club, of which her father was a member. With all the names flying around, you may want to know how to identify and distinguish transcendental and romantic writings, in case you ever forget exactly who's in what movement. The differences are clearest in context. Transcendentalists espouse a nebulous theology, and so their texts emphasize using inner spiritual experiences to approach the divine. They often relate personal experiences, usually in nature, to demonstrate the link between man, God, and the universe. In romantic writings, nature is less pure and more supernatural. It's colored by the sublime, not the divine. Romanticists tend to explore the psychological development of characters, who are usually sensitive, isolated individuals seeking what is beautiful or ideal. Romanticists are also inclined to use rhetorical flourishes. Both Romanticism and Transcendentalism represent the period's zeitgeist of searching out new meaning and questioning the established meaning of times past.
So I hope we are done with the period itself, and our next part of the lecture is dedicated to the main authors, main writers of that period. So furthermore, you will learn about Edgar Allan Poe's works and his biography, and also you'll have information about Emily Dickinson. Hope you are enjoying your lecture.
High forehead topped by disheveled black hair, a sickly pallor, and a look of deep intelligence and deeper exhaustion in his dark, sunken eyes. Edgar Allan Poe's image is not just instantly recognizable, it's perfectly suited to his reputation, from the prisoner strapped under a descending pendulum blade to a raven who refuses to leave the narrator's chamber. Poe's macabre and innovative stories of Gothic horror have left a timeless mark on literature. But just what is it that makes Edgar Allan Poe one of the greatest American authors? After all, horror was a popular genre of the period with many practitioners. Yet Poe stood out thanks to his careful attention to form and style. As a literary critic, he identified two cardinal rules for the short story form. It must be short enough to read in one sitting, and every word must contribute to its purpose. By mastering these rules, Poe commands the reader's attention and rewards them with an intense and singular experience, what Poe called the unity of effect. Though often frightening, this effect goes far beyond fear. Poe's stories use violence and horror to explore the paradoxes and mysteries of love, grief, and guilt, while resisting simple interpretations or clear moral messages. And while they often hint at supernatural elements, the true darkness they explore is the human mind and its propensity for self-destruction. In The Telltale Heart, a ghastly murder is juxtaposed with the killer's tender empathy towards the victim, a connection that soon returns to haunt him. The title character of Lysia returns from the dead through the corpse of her husband's second wife, or at least the opium-addicted narrator thinks she does. And when the protagonist of William Wilson violently confronts a man he believes has been following him, he might just be staring at his own image in a mirror. Through his pioneering use of unreliable narrators, Poe turns readers into active participants who must decide when a storyteller might be misinterpreting or even lying about the events they're relating. Although he's best known for his short horror stories, Poe was actually one of the most versatile and experimental writers of the 19th century. He invented the detective story as we know it, with The Murders in the Rue Morgue, followed by The Mystery of Marie Roget and The Purloined Letter. All three feature the original armchair detective C. Auguste Dupin, who uses his genius and unusual powers of observation and deduction to solve crimes that baffle the police. Poe also wrote satires of social and literary trends and hoaxes that in some cases anticipated science fiction. Those included an account of a balloon voyage to the moon and a report of a dying patient put into a hypnotic trance so he could speak from the other side. Poe even wrote an adventure novel about a voyage to the South Pole and a treatise on astrophysics, all while he worked as an editor, producing hundreds of pages of book reviews and literary theory. An appreciation of Poe's career wouldn't be complete without his poetry, haunting and hypnotic. His best-known poems are songs of grief, or in his words, mournful and never-ending remembrance. The Raven, in which the speaker projects his grief onto a bird who merely repeats a single sound, made Poe famous. But despite his literary success, Poe lived in poverty throughout his career, and his personal life was often as dark as his writing. He was haunted by the loss of his mother and his wife, who both died of tuberculosis at the age of 24. Poe struggled with alcoholism and frequently antagonized other popular writers. Much of his fame came from posthumous and very loose adaptations of his work. And yet, if he could have known how much pleasure and inspiration his writing would bring to generations of readers and writers alike, perhaps it may have brought a smile to that famously brooding visage.
Emily Dickinson's poetry can be mysterious, almost like a riddle. Her lines and verses are short, with a natural style that's almost chatty. These qualities give her one of the most distinctive voices in American poetry. The major poets of her day wrote epics, long pieces that tell a story. While these guys looked outward, writing about history and culture, Dickinson wrote lyrics, poems about the inner life of thoughts and feelings. Yeah, and that's not the only area where she went her own way. Women in those days were strongly encouraged to get married and raise families. And though she had offers, Dickinson never accepted them. Instead, she focused on her work, composing nearly 2,000 poems in just a few decades. On the surface, her poems are about everyday subjects. A dream she had, something she saw in the garden, an emotion she felt. But once you dig a little, there's a world of meaning waiting in those lines. Okay, listen to this one. A bird came down the walk. He did not... Oh, reading poems aloud can help you understand them. Plus, you'll hear all the sounds and rhythms. In poetry, those things are just as important as the meaning. A bird came down the walk. He did not know I saw. He bit an angleworm in halves and ate the fellow raw. And then he drank a dew from a convenient grass, and then hopped sideways to the wall to let a beetle pass. This poem's meter, or rhythm, is really strong. Da-dum, da-dum, da-dum. That's called iambic meter, and here it sounds kind of like a bird hopping. Or maybe it's his nervous heartbeat. He glanced with rapid eyes that hurried all around. They looked like frightened beads, I thought. He stirred his velvet head. No, there's nothing cute about this bird. He's a killer who devours a worm, then washes it down with a drink. And check out that image. Eyes like frightened beads. That's a simile, a poetic comparison that uses like or as. It's also a personification, giving human qualities to an object. Beads aren't something you'd normally think of as frightened, but you can totally imagine those creepy little eyes. Urgh. Let's continue, shall we? Like one in danger, cautious, I offered him a crumb, and he unrolled his feathers and rode him softer home. Yeah, it's not clear who feels more in danger, the speaker or the bird. But the tension is broken when it escapes into the sky. Notice how this stanza ends. He rode him softer home. Softer than what? Dickinson is setting us up to expect another simile. And she spends the entire last stanza making it. Then oars divide the ocean, 2 silver for a seam, or butterflies off banks of noon leap, plashless as they swim. Whoa. We could spend an hour unpacking that. We start with a straight-up comparison. Flying is like rowing in a silvery sea, only softer. Then, it's almost like the speaker gets carried away with the whole water idea. The sky transforms into a river or pond with butterflies diving into it. The edges of this pond are made of time itself, banks of noon. It's like a dream image. It doesn't quite make sense, but it's so vivid. Those last 2 lines are a metaphor, a more direct comparison than a simile. Flying isn't like swimming. It is swimming through time or existence. Good ear. Once the bird's off the ground, the meter smooths out. It's still iambic, but it flows more like conversation, or like water. No, Dickinson knew that crumb and home aren't perfect rhymes. That's an example of slant rhyme, one of her favorite devices. With slant rhyme, words only have to share similar sounds. It let Dickinson experiment with language, and it calls our attention to her choices. She wants us to notice those words. So they might hold clues to what's going on with this poem. I think it might be about a person's spiritual journey. His time on earth is filled with suffering and fear. When he takes off, maybe that's about dying. He leaves the pain of life behind as he travels to his spiritual home. Notice how the bird is absent from the last stanza? He's been replaced by a butterfly, a clue that some change has taken place. And the language is all about stuff that leaves no trace, an oar that makes no crease in the water, and a dive that makes no splash. Yeah, it's like she leaves us with a big mystery. What happens when we die? Those kinds of questions run through her work. Maybe writing poetry was her way of getting closer to an answer. It's true, she spent most of her adulthood alone. She was a recluse, rarely leaving her simple bedroom in Amherst, Massachusetts. Were you listening to that poem? I highly doubt she ever got bored. She used that space to let her imagination run free. Many of her poems are based on things she saw in her family's garden. She published just a handful of poems in local papers. We're really lucky to have the rest of them. Before she died, Emily made her sister promise to burn her letters. So, in 1886, that's just what Lavinia Dickinson did. Well, she had to keep her word. But Lavinia also found a locked chest in her sister's room. Inside were 40 handmade booklets filled with poetry. Lavinia became obsessed with publishing them. The first volume came out 4 years later and was an instant success. It went through 11 printings, and critics loved it. She was immediately recognized as a major American poet, and her voice feels just as fresh today as it did back in 1890.
Ralph Waldo Emerson is the father of American literature. In a series of strikingly original essays written in the mid-19th century, he fundamentally changed the way that America saw its cultural and artistic possibilities, and he enabled a separation from transatlantic literary traditions. "We have listened too long," he wrote, "to the courtly muses of Europe." Emerson's ejection of cultural traditions brought about what one contemporary called America's intellectual declaration of independence, and he established generational conflict and transformation as commanding ideas in American literature. Emerson himself hardly seemed destined to fit a revolutionary mold. He was born in 1803, the son of a Boston preacher, and was descended from a line of New England ministers that went back to the bedrock of 17th century Puritanism. When his father died in 1811, his mother took in boarders to pay the rent. Still, she sent her son to Harvard in 1817, and then Harvard Divinity School to train for the priesthood in 1825. As a young man, Emerson was strongly influenced by a remarkable aunt of his, Mary Moody Emerson, who, though self-taught, had read everything from Shakespeare to the Romantics and had formed a unique religious perspective based on piety, nature, and literature that would resonate powerfully in the life and work of her nephew. So when Emerson was ordained in 1829, marrying the love of his life, Ellen Tucker, in the same year, he was already unsatisfied with the formal nature of New England religious orthodoxy. When Ellen died of tuberculosis just 2 years later, he resigned from the church and soon after embarked on a trip to Europe, leaving on Christmas Day 1832. Two crucial things happened to Emerson on that tour of Europe. In Paris, he went to the famous Jardin des Plantes, a botanical and zoological garden. There he had an epiphany, writing in his journal that, "I feel the centipede in me, the cayman, carp, eagle, and fox. I am moved by strange sympathies. I say continually, I will be a naturalist." Emerson's insight was that nature is in us, a part of us, and not just its higher forms, but in all its grotesquerie and wildness. The second thing that happened on that tour was that Emerson met the English Romantic poets Samuel Taylor Coleridge and William Wordsworth, and found them rather ordinary, dry, and conservative men. The insight that Emerson drew from this was that if great men could be so ordinary, why should not ordinary men be great? As he would write a few years later, meek young men grow up in libraries, believing it their duty to accept the views which Cicero, Locke, Bacon have given, forgetful that Cicero, Locke, and Bacon were only young men in libraries when they wrote these books. Emerson had found two ideas that would guide his life's work: that man and nature are one, and that everyone can recognize that they are a uniquely significant human being. On his return to America in 1833, Emerson became a professional lecturer, giving talks on natural history and literature in halls around New England. He remarried and had several children, presenting a stolid bourgeois appearance to the world. But his inner life was full of turbulence and originality. In his 1836 essay, Nature, Emerson outlined the germ of a new philosophy. A key element of this was the importance of American originality. In its opening lines, Emerson wrote, "Our age is retrospective. It builds the sepulchres of the fathers. It writes biographies, histories, and criticism. The foregoing generations beheld God and nature face to face, we through their eyes. Why should not we also enjoy an original relation to the universe?" America needed to stop looking back to its European heritage and start looking about itself. No past moment was more important than the present moment. No tradition was more important than novelty. No generation was better than the current generation. Everything that matters is here now, insisted Emerson, and that here was America. This was an extension of Emerson's ideas about the significance of the individual that came under the heading of what he called self-reliance. Everywhere Emerson looked, he saw people leading lives that were based on tradition, that were limited by religious forms and social habits. No one could be themselves, Emerson thought, because they were all too busy being what they were supposed to be. Emerson wanted to get rid of each of these burdens. The past religion, and social forms, so that each person could find out who they truly were. As he put it, history is an impertinence and an injury. Our religion we have not chosen, but society has chosen for us, and society everywhere is in conspiracy against the manhood of every one of its members. We must, he argued, live from within, trusting nothing but our own intuitions. For, as he concluded, nothing is at last sacred but the integrity of your own mind. This leaves open a vital question. What is your nature once you have rid yourself of history, tradition, and religion? What can be said is that it isn't necessarily self-indulgence, hedonism, or narcissism. Rather, it's the surrender to that force which Emerson recognized back in the Jardin des Plantes, an obedience to nature itself. By nature, Emerson seemed to mean the natural world, plants, animals, rocks, and sky, but what he really meant was God. Emerson was a pantheist, that is, someone who believed that God exists in every part of creation, from the smallest grain of sand to the stars, but also, crucially, that the divine spark is in each of us. In following ourselves, we are therefore not merely being fickle or selfish, we are rather releasing a divine will that history, society, and organized religion normally hide from us. The individual, as Emerson writes, is a god in ruins, but we have it within us by casting off all custom to rebuild ourselves. Emerson makes this pantheist connection explicit in what are perhaps his most famous lines. Crossing a bare common in snow puddles at twilight under a clouded sky, without having in my thoughts any occurrence of special good fortune, I have enjoyed a perfect exhilaration. I am glad to the brink of fear, standing on the bare ground, my head bathed by the blithe air and uplifted into infinite space. All mean egotism vanishes. I become a transparent eyeball. I am nothing. I see all. The currents of the universal being circulate through me. I am part or particle of God. In the Romantic tradition on which Emerson draws, it is the sublime, great mountains, rushing torrents, dark forests, which releases the inner vision as we find ourselves in awe of them. For Emerson, it's a perfectly dull walk across an ordinary common on a dark winter's evening that brings him to the brink of fear. Emerson's God is in the snow puddles too. Stood there on the common, he disappears, becoming nothing as the currents of God flow through him. What is left is just a transparent eyeball. Such transcendent moments are rare, but they reveal an essential connection between nature, God, and man. They are one. They also give, for Emerson, a proper sense of each individual's importance as a part of God. Transcendentalism became the name of the movement that grew up around Emerson at this time. Another aspect of the Epiphany that was to have a profound effect on American literature was the emphasis on the value of the ordinary. What Emerson put forward in essays like The American Scholar and The Poet was that the American everyday was a proper subject for literature. This was because for Emerson, the transcendentalist God is everywhere, and it's the poet's job to reveal this. There is no object, he wrote, so foul that intense light will not make it beautiful. Even the corpse has its own beauty. This coming from a man who had opened his first wife's tomb a year after her death to take a look. The great American writers who followed Emerson were liberated by his work to look around and write about what they saw and how they lived, transforming the everyday into a vital symbol of something higher and more elusive. Henry David Thoreau's 2 Years at Walden Pond became a book that showed the cosmos reflected in the depths of the waters of a mere pond. The poet Walt Whitman said, "I was simmering, simmering, simmering. Emerson brought me to a boil." Emily Dickinson heard a fly and could write of the other side of death. The novelist Herman Melville took a whaling voyage and made it an allegory of American imperialism and the defiance of nature. In the 20th century, the American critic Harold Bloom looked back at Emerson's originality and saw in it the origin of the strong tradition of American poets. From Robert Frost and Wallace Stevens to John Ashbery, Emerson's legacy to American literature and culture, and indeed to the world, was one of ceaseless invention and forward momentum. As he put it, "I unsettle all things. No facts are to me sacred, none are profane. I simply experiment, an endless seeker with no past at my back."